Erin, go ahead. The recording is started. So
awesome. Thank you very much, folks, for having us here today. I'm Drew Squires-Cabal. My pronouns are he, him. You can find me on Twitter. It's probably the easiest way to let me know that you have a question or feedback. I welcome that, even if I don't get back to you right away. I really appreciate it. I am a PM here at Microsoft. I work in the SQL tools space, and it's kind of peanut butter spread across all of the SQL Server and Azure SQL family of things. Chances are you as a user in the DBA user group, maybe you have an environment that only has one version, but chances are that's not going to be the case forever, just because you're going to have different versions of SQL Server. You may have some Azure SQL instances as well. And so having a strong toolbox and knowing kind of what's all out there, as well as exploring what those things can offer, it can certainly help you in your role. And so that's why I really appreciate the opportunity to come here with Erin today and talk a little bit more about the things that have changed recently for tools out of Microsoft.
So I'm Erin Stellato. I am also a PM at Microsoft on the same team. I see you flipped to the order of our names on there. Did you flip back? You. Yeah, so I don't know that I have a ton to add to what Drew said. I handle some of the more DBA things, right? Like Management Studio and Azure Data Studio. But Drew had a big hand in those before I arrived. So between the two of us, hopefully we can answer questions that folks might have about either of those, as well as the spread of things that Drew also takes care of.
So speaking of the spread of things that kind of this team works on, I wanted to give just a quick snapshot of when we say, Erin and I say we work on SQL tools. This is the things that we have a hand in terms of how SQL Server and Azure SQL can be used or touched or worked with, whether it's down at the driver level. So if you are building something that's interacting with SQL, if you're trying to kind of use a utility that's a command line interface, all the way up through some of the UIs. We're going to touch on a few of these today, but if you see something on the screen that you have a question about later, kind of this is my way of saying all of this is game. Mm-hmm. If you don't see it on here, I'm sure you can still ask, but hopefully this might spur some things in your mind around these are the different ways that I use SQL, and these are the tools that are available. In addition to the drivers in that middle column for libraries and CLIs, one of the reasons why I get so excited about libraries and CLIs is when you learn how to do something in the GUI, or you do something in the GUI and you realize you're doing it often, with CLIs and with libraries, oftentimes you can do things a little bit more efficiently, or find ways to do things more safely without potential errors that can happen when clicking through a wizard, or with preset security settings specific to your environment. So that is why we certainly wanted to bring those into play today. With that said, the things that we're going to focus on today will be the SQL Server PowerShell module, Sqlcmd, Azure Data Studio, the SQL Management Objects, and Ssms. So we're gonna power through all that here in the next 52 minutes.
So if you want to, so right now, the preview for SQL 2022 is available for the PowerShell module, and we will be making a feedback repository available soon with our plan to open source the SQL Server PowerShell module within the next 3 to 6 months. So there's probably a fair bit of you who know that we have, that there is a open source community project called DBA Tools that I would imagine as DBAs, most of you know, love, use heavily, if not definitely something that I would recommend you look into. that includes references to the SQL Server module. Within DBA tools, there's over, I think, 500 commands that will help you with the automation of tasks that you are doing over and over. So to Drew's point, right? If you find that something's being repeated, is there a way to automate it? Is there a way to automate it with PowerShell? So because there's such great support within the community for PowerShell, it is our hope. Oh, and there is a book, right? The PowerShell community has put together a great book on DBA tools. I would definitely recommend that as well. But because this community presence is so strong and so just good, it is our hope that once this is open sourced, that that collaboration will continue to grow. So we're really looking forward to that. You can see an announcement from us when that feedback repository is open, and then also when it gets open sourced.
On to Sqlcmd real quick. So PowerShell is one way to script things out and have utilities created. Sqlcmd itself is a utility where you can open up connections and run scripts, whether they're queries or files from the command line. And so you can kind of use this as like that multi-purpose tool of, oh, I need to do something that is not super specific to an action from DBA tools or maintenance through SMO, but more in the realm of shorter scripts or really specific long scripts for like maintenance. Sqlcmd has been around for quite some time, and so the list of things you can do with it is kind of this ... because so many people have found great things that they can do with it. What we found is that with Sqlcmd, the current one that you know and love, that's installed with SQL Server, it's available for Linux in the MS SQL Tools package. It's based on the ODBC driver. And at the end of the day, what this really means is that it works great in specific environments where the driver is available, and it is constrained functionality-wise to the ODBC driver and the functionality that comes in and is released in that driver. Specific functionality that we were hearing from users, especially in CI/CD pipeline environments, is that they had security requirements where they really needed to use service principal authentication or managed identity authentication with Azure Active Directory, or they were dealing in more cross-platform environments where it was harder to get the ODBC driver installed, especially in the Linux and the Mac OS space. And then even coming into some of the scenarios where folks are on an ARM64 device, whether it's Mac OS or a Surface X device. And so with this request, we got to a point where we wanted to have a Sqlcmd ubiquitous utility that you can do these really fundamental things, but without the requirement of a driver install. And that's where Go Sqlcmd comes in. The name Go Sqlcmd simply comes from it being written in the Go language, and in Go language, the driver itself, the Golang driver that we maintain, is compiled right in with the utility. So you get a single executable for Go Sqlcmd. You can install it either from the many Linux repositories like app or yum, or you can just kind of download the executable, the zip, and put it in your environment. But that's kind of where the name came from. This is completely open source. It's available in preview, so you can head out to the GitHub repository, Microsoft/Go Sqlcmd, and it's going to be able to do those scripting things. It's going to be able to handle those tasks, but with the addition of AAD auth types, as well as a broader platform compatibility. So to give you an idea of kind of how Sqlcmd might work, just in case you're someone who hasn't used it before and you're ready to try it out, knowing that there's this new opportunity for it. You specify the server. You can add authentication information, And you can either give it input and output, so that's that top line where you've got a SQL script and then you want to put the output into a text file. Or you can give it a query, that's that second line, and then if you don't give it an output, it'll just output it right to the console. Now, where Sqlcmd goes from being this like screwdriver and goes to being this really robust utility is where it has the ability to bring in Sqlcmd variables. So if I had a test.sql file that had some variables in it, like the login timeout or passing in that server name variable, then when I run that script, it's going to use those variable values, and then you can override that when you execute it. In this case, I haven't, but I just have input ctest.sql, and it's going to use those variable values. So you can really make your scripts more robust after you've found the way to use them. And then this is all from the command line or in your CI/CD environment. So really quick, just to run this point home, completely open source, so you can literally interact with the engineers that are working on this. We've got a recap. There are a few breaking changes. Most of them are based on security requirements where we don't want passwords to be passed in, because when you pass a password into your command line, it actually gets stored in the history of your bash shell or your Z shell, and so terrible things can happen. You don't want to do that. So that's the root of most of the breaking changes. But I highly encourage you that if you're in the Sqlcmd automation space, check out the repository to interact with the team.
Okay, so a little bit more about PowerShell, and this is more on the Azure Data Studio side. So big chunk here specific to Azure Data Studio. First thing to mention is this VS Code PowerShell extension. So those of you who've worked in Azure Data Studio may know that you have the console and you can do PowerShell right from there. This extension was updated this past month by the VS Code team, and I went to the release notes and I can paste those in, which this quote just I thought was like pretty powerful, right? That it was a complete overhaul of that engine within these services with a more reliable and stable user experience. So it is now available in the ADS Marketplace so that you can install it for Azure Data Studio. And if you go to the next slide for me. So basically what you'll see in here, right? So at this point, this is just a screenshot from Azure Data Studio where I've downloaded that extension right from the marketplace and installed it, and you can see that I've got the extension enabled. It gives the version there. It's got IntelliSense, and so you now have the ability to have more of that PowerShell tool experience, right, that you're used to from launching that interface available right within Azure Data Studio. So you're not having to flip between applications. So this was really cool. And then the other things that we have in Azure Data Studio, I've been talking about these, I feel like, since I started at Microsoft about 6 months ago. And this is, what's that?
Feels like ages, doesn't it?
Feels like ages, but it's flown by. So there's two features that I want to talk about today that are still in preview that are applicable for newer DBAs and also veteran DBAs. So Table Designer, and these are both in preview. So Table Designer is in preview, and this exists in Management Studio. So for those of you that live and die and breathe and everything in Management Studio, I am not telling you, I need to make this very clear, I'm not telling you that you have to switch over to Azure Data Studio. But I do want you to know about the options that are there, because maybe some of the things that we're doing in Azure Data Studio are just a tiny bit better than what exists in Ssms, and you might want to give them a try. So I know that senior DBAs, veteran DBAs, most of you probably don't use Table Designer. That's fine. But here's the thing, right? You have this UI to create objects, which creating your tables, creating the constraints, creating the indexes. And one of the things that exists in Azure Data Studio is support for temporal tables, system version tables, for memory optimized for graph tables. And some of you are like, no, hold on a second. I know that I can do that in Management Studio. But the thing is when you create those objects in Management Studio, it just generates a T-SQL script for you then to, do Control-Shift-M and drop in and like put in all of the descriptions, words, etc. This is the visual interface for you to create those objects without having to use T-SQL. You can then choose to script it out. So this is, I think, great for folks who are maybe not as comfortable with T-SQL, who like that visual interface, whether you're new to SQL or not. And this is, again, in preview, which means we're still working on it. You have the ability also to rearrange your columns. You have the ability to add new columns in any location. There is work that obviously happens behind the scenes for that. So in some cases, I might say, while you can do all that in the UI, there are scenarios where it might be better to actually script those changes out and do those yourself. But the team's been working really hard on this. And because it's in preview, if there are things that you see in here that you think we could do better or you think are missing, there's still time for us potentially to get those changes in there. So we definitely want to hear from folks about this.
I mean, it's probably not speak now or forever hold your peace.
Right.
It's definitely let us know.
Yeah, exactly. I have a better chance, I think, of getting stuff done now than I might later on. Okay, and then Query Plan Viewer, which I've spent a lot of time doing tuning over the years. So I'm very excited about this and the ability to have some input onto what happens here. So just like in Management Studio, we have estimated and actual plans. We have top operations. So for those of you that have used SentryOne Plan Explorer, which SentryOne is now owned by SolarWinds, from what I've seen, quite frankly, I don't see any recent changes to Plan Explorer. So there are some things in Plan Explorer that I know a lot of folks love, like that top operations window. So we have sortable columns in there. We also have the ability, when you see an operator in that top operations, you can click on the operator and hop to that operator within the plan. We also have plan comparison. So I know that there was a ton of work that went into plan comparison for Ssms. But I'll be really honest in that I always found it a little bit clunky, a little bit unwieldy. And there are some things that we've done differently within Azure Data Studio. So you can select the query, like if you've got multiple queries in there, this is what I mean by improved readability. If you have multiple queries in the plan, you can pick the specific query. So you're only viewing one plan at a time, and you can look at those in both a horizontal, which is what we're used to, right, or a vertical orientation. We have the properties window that does comparison between them, and it's probably way more interesting for me to show you these things as opposed to just talk about them. So we're going to switch control here, and see if I can make this work correctly. Yes, I can. All right, so as a reminder, this is a preview feature. So in order to see either one of these, right, if you open up Azure Data Studio, which by the way, as a reminder, if you have Ssms installed, it installs Azure Data Studio by default. You can do a command line to not install it. But if you have Ssms, you likely have Azure Data Studio as well. So if you open up Azure Data Studio and you're not seeing the things that I'm about to show you, you have to enable them. You're going to go into File, Preferences, and Settings, and then there is a Enable Preview Features option that you need to have checked. So we're going to make sure here that we're in Wide World Importers, and I'm going to zoom out here just to make it, I'm on my laptop, so the screen's a little bit smaller, but just like Ssms, right? We have estimated an actual plan. So estimated is only going to be, right, when you run that, or when you use that, it's just going to be for the query you have highlighted. Actual plan, when you're clicking that, it's going to enable that for your entire query window, just like it does in Ssms. So if I click Enable Actual Plan, oh, this is fun today. There we go. You'll see that then disable is here, right? So I'm enabling that for the query connection, just like we see within Management Studio. So if I want to go ahead and look at this particular query, I can go ahead and run that. And then in my output, I've got my plan, right? This is what we're used to seeing. Although you'll notice that since I'm in Azure Data Studio, I can do dark mode. So for those of you that love dark mode, you can now use that in Azure Data Studio and look at your plans that way. So here's the top operations window that I mentioned. We have information that's useful from the plan. I can sort on these columns, and then imagine I had a much bigger plan with way more operators, right? I can click on that and it will hop to that operator within the plan. So for those times where you're like, what's the most expensive operator, or where's my cardinality estimator way off? Oh, it's for this operator. Let me go find that in the plan. That suddenly becomes way easier. And there are some additional things that we're looking to add into this top operation, so stay tuned there. Let me bring this down just a little bit. I have a stored procedure in here. Let me just go ahead. Actually, I want to run this really quick. So in this query, I did some pre-population of data here, but one of the things that I wanted to point out that we handle is when there are multiple missing index recommendations in Management Studio. Some of you may know that it only shows one. Here in ADS, we're showing all of them. Now, those of you that are really astute are looking at these missing index recommendations and you're like, 2 of those look to be exactly the same. That is true. That is not an ADS thing. That's just reading what's in the XML. So those are both appearing there. But we can display multiple missing index recommendations. And then, of course, you can click on that. It will open in a new window. You're obviously going to change the name of the recommended index before you create it. You'll do some testing, etc. But it's right there and it's easily available. Now, if we take a larger plan, and I'm going to drop this into a new query window, assuming that I can copy and paste correctly. And we're going to get the estimated plan here. And let me zoom out a little bit just so that you can see this. So this is a little bit bigger plan than we've been looking at, but this is a tiny change that we made because we got some feedback that sometime when you're like working in a plan and you're moving around in it and the pop-ups keep coming up and it's hard to see things, we added this little button way over here in the bottom, which will turn off those tooltips. So we're really taking a lot of feedback about usability here and like the struggles that folks have when they're working with plans. So I can disable the tooltips. So now as I'm moving around this plan, I'm not going to get those pop-ups right all over the place. When I'm really trying to say, okay, what are these operators here? What are we doing? What am I looking at? And then the other thing to notice here is that we've moved the cost values out to decimals for plans with more operators. So those of you that have plans that maybe have 50, 100, 200 operators in them, you know that at some point, like all these costs show up as 0, and it can be really hard to find some of those operators that are of interest. So for larger plans, we've taken that out to decimal points to try to help identifying the plans which are problematic, or the operators which are problematic within a plan. And then what I want to show you is plan comparison. So I'm going to run this store procedure and we'll get our plan here. And then if I right click, I have the option to, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see it. I have the option to compare execution plan. And as an aside, everything that shows up in this pop-up also shows up in the toolbar to the right. So we'll go ahead and we'll do compare execution plan, pops open into a new window. Now within this new window, I'm going to say add a plan. I've got a plan already saved here for this. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And so now if I want to do comparison between these two, this stored procedure has more than one query. It's got 2 queries. So notice that way up here, you can see I have query 1 of 2, query 1 of 2. So what I like about this as compared to what happens when I try and look at this in Ssms is that you can really focus on one query's plan at a time. Again, no, I'm not trying to criticize what exists in Ssms, but we've tried to make it just a little bit simpler and less stuff, right? So that you can really focus on individual queries in their performance. So I have the first query for the store procedure selected both in the top and the bottom. And if I want to look at the properties here for this, I'm going to click on the properties button up at the top, and that's going to open the properties pane where I have the information from the top plan compared against the information from the top, or sorry, from the bottom, based upon the operator that I have selected. So if I go ahead and I select the select operator in both, right, you can see that we have I'll zoom in here so that maybe this is a little bit easier. We've done top and bottom plan right here. And then we're trying to make it easier for you to identify not just what's different, but what's important. So there's probably going to be some further changes to this. I'm in Redmond this week, which is great because I get to see my team, but also because I get to talk to the engineers directly. So we talked about this on Monday, and we are making more changes to this before we're going to make it generally available. So, right, notice that we're trying to flag here the things, the value decreased, if it increased, or in some cases, it's just different. We can't determine if it went up and down, right? It's just a different value. So all of this is designed to make comparing plans much easier for you. So I'm going to pause for a second because I know some questions came in there.
I think that are a really good question. So someone is listening and looking at this and saying, hey, that multiple SQL feature is really useful for me, and now I need to know, do I really need to look at using ADS? What's the likelihood that something like that's going to make it over to Ssms?
The likelihood is, here's the thing, right? I have to think about how I want to frame my answer. So it's not sustainable for us to do something in Ssms and do the exact same thing in Azure Data Studio, right? It's not possible for us to take everything that's in Ssms and bring it over to Azure Data Studio. So let me be clear, Ssms is not going away. Azure Data Studio is going to continue to get new things added and developed in it and extensions developed for it. Ssms is going to continue to have changes made to it as well. But we're not able to make simultaneous changes to both. So what we're doing in Azure Data Studio very likely is not going to get into Management Studio. It is not how we are really able to invest the engineer's time, right? They each kind of have their purpose. So we are looking at adding additional methods for hopping from Ssms over to Azure Data Studio. Some of those already exist. You may not be aware of them, but there are places where you can go from Ssms over to Azure Data Studio. That's one reason that we install Azure Data Studio with Management Studio by default, because we know that we can't do everything in both. And so we're trying to make it possible for you to move between them as easily as possible.
So conceptually, I've been using Ssms all the time, and I want to use ADS to compare plans, but I don't have to do everything in ADS. I can go between them.
Exactly. Exactly. We are not saying you have to choose. What we are saying is these are both great tools that we're continuing to invest in, both of them. And there are going to be cases where you might want to use one over the other. That's fine. That's what we expect.
I'm going to have to get my Ssms tattoo modified.
Oh. All right. Are there any other questions?
I don't think so. Tayob clarified that plan comparison in general is available in Ssms.
Yes.
Query.
Yes. That is one place where I think where I just like that a little bit better. I mean, there's also all these zoom options that exist up there. The toggle orientation, I'll be honest in that I'm so used to looking at plans this way that I didn't even think of this, but this is why I love our engineers. They're like, well, hey, what if I want to look at it this way instead? So those of you that have giant monitors, you may prefer that, or if you've got plans that are really deep this way as opposed to wide, right? This orientation might make more sense to you. So I think that was all the things that I wanted to show in there. Oh, let me just show one thing real quick for Table Designer. For those of you that haven't, I love query plans. So I tend to spend a lot of time in those. So let me just go to this test database. Hold on. Why is that going all over the place? There we go. Tables. And what you can do, right click, new table. And let me zoom in a little bit here, right? So this is the table designer within Azure Data Studio. So you can see, if I just do a little drawing here, right? Here we're selecting the columns that are of interest to us, but then we have the ability to specify primary and foreign keys. We can do our constraints. We can do indexes as well. And then over here on the right side, you can choose if it's a graph table, whether it's node or edge, and then you can do system versioning and you can do memory optimized as well, all within that UI. And then you can see down here at the bottom that we're providing that script as well. So you can publish this directly, or you can take that script and use that, whatever you prefer. So I think that the team's continuing. There's still some improvements that we need to be made. For example, we didn't originally have indexes with included columns. So I was like, friends, I love included columns in my indexes, and I know others do too. So sometimes you forget the T-SQL for that. It's easy to come in here to Table Designer, create that index here, and then script it out, publish it when you're ready. All right.
Question in the chat, are we stepping away from file groups?
Are we stepping away from file groups? No, I guess maybe add some more context about what makes you think that, or anything, like help me understand. There was another question that just came in about Ssms. I saw it, I didn't get to read it.
Sounds like Ssms development hours are cost prohibitive. As someone who uses Ssms a lot, perhaps we need a session on how to change mindsets to embrace ADS instead of Ssms, or is it a use the best tool for the task at hand scenario?
It is a use the best tool for the task at hand. So if it came across like I was saying that Ssms development is prohibitive, that was not my intention at all. It's just that there's a finite amount of budget, right? There's a finite number of engineers that we have to work on things. And if I had 1,000 of them, then I could do it all, but I don't. There are constraints that we have to work within. And so we're also working on kind of solidifying the direction for Azure Data Studio. Everybody knows what Ssms is, right? This is the tool that once you've been working with SQL Server for a while, that's where you go, because it has quote unquote everything. But not everybody needs everything, right? Not every person who works with SQL Server needs Ssms. And so that's where Azure Data Studio really comes in. And there are some, I'm not at a point where I can give you everything for the roadmap, but that's coming. I'm going to be able to do that. But there are folks who can do a ton of what they need to do in Azure Data Studio, and there's a few gaps that we need to fill. Table Designer is a big thing. Being able to view query plans is another kind of fundamental thing that folks need in order to be able to start looking at performance. And so there's a subset of folks who can spend most of their time in ADS. There's a subset of folks who continue to live in Ssms, and that's fine. And then there's going to be others who will go between, and that's great. So I hear you in that convincing folks who use Ssms that Azure Data Studio is something to explore, that's a conversation worth having, however that happens, for sure. Is availability group management coming to Azure Data Studio? Not anytime soon. No, that's going to continue to stay in Ssms.
So there was a expansion on the file group clarification,
Yeah.
and then also a couple things coming in the chat about the explanation you just gave on kind of Ssms and Azure Data Studio. The file groups isn't surfaced in the table designer.
Ah.
So that was just kind of a question, and maybe that's some good feedback around something that folks would like to see.
That is good feedback. So your point is, when I create the object, sometimes I don't want to create it in the primary file group, which is the option that we're giving here. If you want to create it in a different file group, there's no way to do that here. Noted. Very good feedback. Thank you. That's the kind of thing that I want to hear. Yeah, I would bring you treats if I could.
There was a question in the chat around DBA tools being wrapped around Sqlcmd 2, which is a community project that I am, to be honest, not super familiar with at the moment. So I'm going to answer this question. The question is, has Sqlcmd caught up to Sqlcmd 2? And I'm going to say, frankly, I don't know, and I can't give you that answer. What I do really appreciate the honesty around Sqlcmd was letting us down and we needed to look at something else. Please don't be afraid to tell us when our baby is ugly, because I am going to look into that, because as we work on Go Sqlcmd, we do want to make sure that we're filling those gaps. So I'm not going to tell you right now that, those DBA tool commands should be rewrapped around Go Sqlcmd, because I can't promise you that it's filling the Sqlcmd 2 changes there.
Ooh, so the question there was schema name, right? Where are we choosing the schema here within the object? That's another great point. We don't have that either, do we? We're just gonna, where is it?
Drop down.
Oh, it's oh, thank you. We do have it. I lied. See, this is why I have Drew. There we go.
You can tell which one of us definitely needs the graphical table designer and which one.
Right. Yeah. So in this database, right, I think I only have the DBO schema. If I go to wide world importers and I say new table and I say schema, there we go. So that is in there. We don't have file group, but we do have schema. Does it allow for creating a new schema, Justin? Not from here. No. But feedback taken that you want that within Azure Data Studio, which is really under security, right? So if I could make an assumption here, it would be nice if you also had the security folder here within Azure Data Studio and had, or not just the folder, but also the ability to create schemas users through the UI in Azure Data Studio, not just T-SQL. I'm gonna assume that's kind of what you're looking for.
I think that's a valid assumption, but there are 80-something people on the chat, and they could probably overwhelm us with their feedback if they so wanted to let us know in the chat really quickly what things in that security folder they would like to see the most.
Because I'm on campus with the engineers, and there's nothing like direct user feedback to share.
I will pause while you all type those very long words.
We have a drink of water. Actually, I don't have anything else that I wanted to show in this demo. So if there's anything else related to Query Plan Viewer or Table Designer or anything else in Azure Data Studio, now's the time to ask the question. Do you want me to flip control back to you?
Steal it back.
That's good, because for whatever reason I can't give it back to you. Here we go. Thank you.
Okay. While everyone is opening up Ssms, looking at the security folder, deciding what things that they use there the most to put that information in the chat, I'm not kidding. I do want to touch briefly on SMO, which is SQL Management Objects. And SQL Management Objects is potentially invisible to you unless you open up the About panel in Ssms a lot, and then you see it tells you what version of SQL Management Objects is in that version. SMO is invisible likely for good reason. It's a .NET library that you can use when you're building an application, whether it's Ssms or a small command line tool. When you're building in .NET, you can bring in .NET libraries to add additional functionality. SQL Management Objects, like the name suggests, gives you access to APIs for interacting with SQL Server and Azure SQL programmatically to do management things, or scripting out objects, management objects. So it's a really powerful tool for kind of amplifying what your management tasks need to be for SQL Server. And so there are other tools that are already surfacing SMO. So I don't want to suggest that you have to start from the ground up, but I think it's worthwhile knowing that you can. Or if you're involved in development of an open source project that does use SMO, maybe you'll enjoy some of the recent updates. So these are both equally exciting, but if you look at the version history, the versions 161.x that are out have support for SQL 22. So if you are exploring working with SQL 22, just make sure that you're using the SMO versions 161.x and up. But even better than that, you have access to the SMO code now. It was open sourced just a few months ago. So that means that if you go to github.com/Microsoft/SQL Management Objects, you can literally go to the repository. Like I said with Go Sqlcmd, you can be interacting with engineers there. We've had community pull requests come in, so folks have looked at what SMO is doing and either said, I don't like the way it's doing this, or there's a bug that I want to change. And so folks are starting to shape SMO a little bit more. So that's out there, and we are frankly, Erin mentioned the SQL Server PowerShell module being open source. We are frankly wanting the bulk of the SQL tools, especially in the utility space, to be open source so that we can collaboratively meet people's needs as they kind of try to create efficiencies in their workflows, to kind of cut to the chase with that. So with it being open source and potentially a new concept for folks, I did want to just kind of like give you a really quick, this is what it would look like if you're going to get elbow deep into using SMO. So I have a server locally in a container. It has just a teeny tiny little baby database with a single table. So just kind of setting the standard there on what it is. And I've made it so simple because I want to just have a really quick sample of a .NET Console app. So a .NET Console app is something that compiles to an executable. And so when you would run it, where's my executable? You could run that executable other places, or we're just going to run it interactively as we debug it. But what this project is I've started from .NET new console app, and then filled in a little bit of code where I've said, hey, instead of taking arguments from the command line, I'm just going to hard code them for the purposes of the sample. So this is my localhost SA and password. And first things first is just to create that server connection. So I've said I don't need to use SSL with my login, and that's the login and password. And just to prove that the connection has worked, I want to get some information from that server object. So SQL Management Objects, the server object here has specific properties that get loaded in when it connects. So when I'm working in this tool, my server.information can print out the version and other information about that server. So maybe you need to programmatically explore your server estate. You can do that through there. Diving in a little bit further into the objects and the way that Smo works with it, is that I can say, hey, I've got a work order database on that server, and I just want to start scripting out some objects. So there's a scripter object that I can point to the server and set some options for the way that it scripts things, and then iterate through each of the tables. So DB is the database that I associated with the server. So these are objects within my application, not ones on the servers. And as I iterate through them, I'm going to skip the system tables and then generate that output to the command line. You could be having it instead of console.writeLine for the script, you could be putting it into a file, but I'm lazy. So what this looks like, so maybe you're not into .NET super a whole lot. So to start this project, I just did .NET new console and then worked in my file here. I'm going to do a .NET build to make sure that my project compiles. The Smo using statements bring that library into my application, as well as I've gone out to NuGet, of course, SQL Server Management Objects, and grabbed the 161 version in case I want to work with SQL Server 2022. My build succeeded, and so I'm just going to do a .NET run real quick. What this is going to do is it's going to run through my console app real quick. We're going to see that there's like a database that's connected, the server version, and then it's going to script out all the tables, which there's just that one. It's going to connect. My laptop fan is firing up. There we go. All right, so we got the server name, and then it started scripting things out. I had a unresolved entities because this is for an example later, so it doesn't script those, and then it spits out the script for my table. So that is Smo in a nutshell.
I have some questions that are general ones. I have to scroll back up. So is there a way to open Azure Data Studio without having it open the last project that you handled? So actually, it's funny because this is one of the things that I really like about Azure Data Studio, right? When I close it, if I have scripts open, when I open Azure Data Studio again, those scripts are right there. Similar behavior for the projects, but there may be a setting. If any of you have never been into the settings window, there's a ton of stuff in there, just as an aside. So in Management Studio, you might be used to Tools Options to go and look at configuration. In here, you're going to go into the settings window.
I'm going to have to search for it and then post that on social media or add it to the deck before it gets sent out.
Okay. So you think there's a way to do it?
I think so. Just trying to remember.
Okay. Okay. So we'll follow up on that. Then my next question for you. Any plans to speed up / optimize schema comparison?
Yes. So is this a specific tool schema comparison, or I will just start answering broadly?
It doesn't say, but can you quickly show, like, how many of you actually, do you know that you can do Schema Compare within Azure Data Studio? Like, because I didn't know this until I started working here. Like, I always thought, oh, I need a third-party tool to do that. So I know that third-party tools do this. Thank you. Somebody didn't know it. So you can do Schema Compare within Azure Data Studio. Tyab says he still uses Visual Studio. That's great. You can do it here as well, just so you know. Not happy with you.
I can still open it up to at least show it.
I put Drew on the spot. So this is like typing in a demo. I'm gonna make him do everything, like ran off the cuff here in the demo. Because we still have 6 minutes.
So yeah, so Schema Compare, as well as the whole data tier application wizard, which is kind of in that same family of functionality, but you might know it from Ssms as well, where you can extract and deploy DAC packs as well as import and export backpacks. So that's a thing to have kind of in the back of your mind. That is available in the Object Explorer in Azure Data Studio, as long as you have installed the extension. So one of the things about Azure Data Studio, I think someone kind of mentioned it in the chat earlier, is it takes a minute to orient yourself once you land in Azure Data Studio, not only finding where new things are, but also like, hey, something's not there yet. Schema Compare is a great example of this, where it's an extension. Apparently I need to install an update to it. So once I've installed this, then I have the Schema Compare option in Azure Data Studio. If I launch Schema Compare, it's going to ask me about the source and target. I saw a comment in the chat about, hey, do it from projects as well, or that it was enabled in projects. You can do schema comparison with projects as well. So maybe I do that right now just for funsies.
And while Drew's rolling through that, like I put this in the chat, but the extensions are a huge key to Azure Data Studio. So, right, Ssms, again, has everything, right, that you might want. Azure Data Studio starts with some basics, and then you can bolt on, right? You can pull in the things that you need through extensions, only what you need, not, right, the entire farm.
Yeah. So whether you're using Schema Compare in Azure Data Studio or Visual Studio, super happy that you're using it. The functionality for Schema Compare comes out of DAC effects. And so I promise I'm not deflecting the question around performance, because I want to address kind of broadly schema comparison and publish and import export performance are all things that are constantly being looked at, and things that we're really aware of that we don't want to let not improve. Because one of the pieces that's happened is that DAC effects has been around for a while, and it was built at a time when databases had a certain number of objects. And I was troubleshooting with a customer the other day, and I kid you not, they had 8 million database objects between tables and columns, and computed columns and indexes. And when you compile all of those, the schema objects, to do a comparison, it takes a long time with the way that DAC effects is currently set up. So there are short-term things to improve the speed of it, as well as kind of the ongoing DAC effects performance question and how that feeds into Schema Compare.
There's another question that there may be an answer to, but I want to hear your thing. Is there any way to do, Johan phrased it as a column modification inventory. So let's say that I want to find all the tables or all of the columns of due date, and I need to change the data type. Is there a way to do that easily? And Alan was doing it with PowerShell to iterate through the tables and the columns and find them. And then someone else mentioned creating a database project and then finding all of those occurrences.
So to change the data type, both of those would be good approaches, and it would kind of be it depends on where you're currently at. I am not great with PowerShell, so it would very potentially take me a very long time to do it in PowerShell. But just like Erin talked about earlier, there's the SQL Server PowerShell module, and there's DBA tools. So if you're good in PowerShell, there's a SQL tool that can enable you to do this challenge that way. I'm potentially, obviously, to some of you, a lot more comfortable with SQL projects. And so, yes, I would go into my SQL project. You can do find and replace. There's a refactor component within Visual Studio to do that as well. And then you can either do the publish of that SQL project or do the generate script to get the output script in case you want to do any further fine tuning of what would happen when that gets applied.
Okay, we're almost at time, but there's one more thing. There's one more quick slide that I want to talk to, which is funny because it is Ssms. So somebody commented to me recently, you never do any sessions on Ssms. And it's like, you know what, you're right, we don't. So point taken. So just a few things I want to know, right? The current release, the GA release is 18.12.1. That came out in, I think that was June, that we made that available. We're releasing SSMS 19 Preview 3 very, very soon. And that is a preview, right? So that is not GA. We are not planning, this hasn't really been announced elsewhere, but we're not planning to release another 18 build of SSMS. So until we get 19 GA'd out the door, 18.12.1 is where you're going to be sitting. What's new in the preview? We've got support for contained AG, so that's a big thing coming in SQL 2022. Also Ledger, which is available on Azure SQL Database already and will be available in SQL 2022 as well. Justin's comment about Management Studio taking longer and longer to load. I've gotten multiple comments about that. It's something that I need to talk to the team about. This is, again, part of the challenge of having the tool that has everything, is that it's a lot of code, right? There's a lot of stuff that continues to be added to it. And so and I can tell you that one of the engineers very frequently puts in the comments of a bug or an issue, right? The note of like, pull this code out because we don't need it anymore. So there is a constant task of like looking at that code as they're going through it and making changes, but it's a pretty big tool. So noted, and I'll make sure to share that with the team. Lars is asking about 18.12.1 and SSMS 19 installed side by side. Yes, if you have a previous preview for SSMS, you do have to install that before you install the next preview, but 18 and 19 can live side by side. I have that installed on my machine, actually. So we've gone a couple minutes over, which I know that this hits the lunch hour for some folks, so we apologize for that. We can stay and answer questions as needed, but thanks for showing up today, friends.
Thanks so much, everybody. Well, you can stay for a few minutes and answer a few more questions. I know that there's one or two more as I scroll back through the chat, so we will get to those, but just wanted to thank everyone and I really appreciate the feedback that you shared today and continue to share. So much.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin and Drew. So folks, if you have to go, I know this is a business hour meet, so you can go, but if Erin and Drew, only if they have time, I'll keep the line open and put your questions, comments, so they will answer it. But if they have to go, they also have full-time jobs and other things. We understand that, but I do want to thank both of them. If Erin and Drew, if any one of you want to pick up on that comment about, or I'll search if anyone has a talk already switching or making it easier between SSMS and ADS. I really don't see it as a switching option, right? As you mentioned, it's what you need, right? Use both. Like I use both pretty much every day. So, but I'll see if we can talk offline. So, folks, if you have really questions or comments related to this topic, just put it in there because I will respect everyone's time. But I'll keep the line open. Yes, you will get the recording link, SQL that I already posted it once for you, so I'm going to post it again.
There was a question in the chat a little while back from Justin around, does the team have some thoughts on how long extensions remain available when the developer hasn't worked on it in, say, 2 or 3 years? This is a really important question because it addresses a couple different layers of developer time, relevance of extensions, and then the ADS marketplace and kind of the shape of it. I'm going to take a stab at it because, frankly, I have extensions that I've published that I haven't touched in 2 to 3 years. But I think Erin may have things to add after that as well. The ADS team in the marketplace, when an extension gets published to the marketplace from a third party, like the ones that I did in my free time before I joined Microsoft, or other developers that have come in and joined that, like that's fantastic. And we really appreciate that folks are leveraging the extensibility of Azure Data Studio to add additional functionality that fits their specific use or what other people might find functional. When things get published to the ADS marketplace, the team takes a look at the extension to make sure that it's not obviously malicious, but we don't do like in-depth security requirement checks, or we don't do in-depth quality checks. It's a nice cursory review of the extension, but it is not the same as when we, Microsoft, publish a first-party extension and we have compliance requirements and quality gates and things like that. So we, in the interest of being open to the community contributing to Azure Data Studio, the bar is not set at such a high level that we oftentimes maintain internally. And in the ADS marketplace, there's not a quick and easy way to monetize your extension. This is coming out of the VS Code core, which also doesn't have that. So the development is open source in general. Some of them are closed source, but most of them are open source. So people are doing them out of the goodness of their hearts and in their free time for the most part. And so there's an element of it where it might just not be an indication of the quality of the extension if it hasn't been touched in 2 or 3 years, especially if it's a simpler tool. But if it has serious bugs in it, then by all means report it to the extension author. So it's not a straightforward thing where the team's going to go through and just like remove extensions if they haven't been touched in 4 years, because they still might be super helpful. There are tools that we publish that don't get tons of updates recently, and I'm not talking about Ssms, I'm talking about some of the CLIs that still are useful to people, and we don't just take them away. Do you have anything else, thoughts on the marketplace?
You hit it, you covered it.
Let's see here. Yeah, DBA Tools does a lot of stuff, and they absolutely use lots of different components for sure.
All right.
Well, this was fun.
It was. Thank you again all for attending and for the feedback. We'll definitely take a lot of those comments, share them internally, and we will get the script that I used, some of the code that Drew had. Did you have code, or did you just do UI stuff?
It was a quick sample that I can share,
okay.
Absolutely.
And then the deck, we'll get that over to Tyler to share wherever it gets shared.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording here.